The carriage wheels had not yet stopped turning when he pushed the door open with his shoulder, because he had never in his life been kept waiting by a latch, and he saw no reason to begin learning patience now. The gravel under his boots was the wrong color. That was the first thing he noticed, and he noticed it the way a man notices a missing tooth with his tongue before his mind has caught up. Pale stone where dark stone had been. Raked into clean furrows, the marks of the rake still visible, the pattern unfamiliar. He stood a moment with one gloved hand on the carriage door and frowned at the drive as if it had insulted him. Behind him the horses blew, and the coachman, who had been in his service 11 years and had grown very quiet on the last stretch of the road, did not speak. The afternoon light lay long across the lawn. There was a smell of cut box and turned earth and something faintly sweet that he could not name, and he disliked, immediately, that he could not name it. 3 months, he thought. Only 3 months, perhaps 4. He did not count well lately, and he had never thought he would need to. He looked up at the house. The house looked back. The shutters on the west wing had been repainted a color that was not the color he had chosen 7 years ago when he had chosen everything, and the brass on the door, which had been allowed for years to dull into a domestic green, gleamed now as if it had been instructed to. A footman he did not recognize stood at the top of the steps. The footman did not move when he came up, did not bow, inclined his head only, the small, precise inclination of a man receiving an unexpected guest at an inconvenient hour, and said, with the courtesy of stone, "Your Grace." The word landed strangely. He had been called it all his life. He had been called it that morning by the innkeeper at the last post stage, who had bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the bar. He had been called it by the woman in the carriage 4 days ago, the woman he had left in town with a new bracelet and a small theatrical sigh. And the word from her mouth had been a kind of teasing, a thing she did with her tongue. From the footman, it was simply a fact. He waited on the top step for the door to open further. It did not. "Is her ladyship within?" he said, and was annoyed at the rasp in his own voice. He had not slept on the road. He had not slept well in some weeks. The footman said, "Her ladyship is in the small drawing-room, Your Grace," and stepped aside the precise width of a man, not an inch more. He had a few seconds, walking through his own hall, to decide what tone to take, and he could not decide. He had rehearsed nothing on the road, because he had never in his life needed to rehearse with her. She had received his absences, his moods, the late hours and the curt notes, the year he had spent in the capital and the months he had spent at the lodge, with the same composed patience with which she had received the news, on the morning after their wedding, that his mother would be living with them until she chose otherwise. She had a gift for receiving. He had relied on it the way a man relies on a roof, without thinking, until weather. He had not thought there would be weather. He passed the long mirror in the hall and did not look at himself, because he had caught, in the corner of his eye, that the portrait above the console had been moved. Not removed, moved. 2 inches to the left, perhaps, so that the lamp no longer fell on his grandfather's painted hand. Small things. He told himself, walking, that they were small things. The runner under his boots was new. The flowers in the niche were not the flowers his housekeeper bought. The hall smelled of beeswax and of a kind of lemon polish he associated, vaguely, with his wife's mother's house. And he had not been in his wife's mother's house in 9 years, and the memory of it arrived now with the particular sting of a thing one has been careful not to remember. He reached the small drawing room. The door was open. She was sitting by the window with a book in her lap, and she did not look up at once, because she was finishing a sentence, and she had always finished her sentences. He had teased her about it once, in the first year, when she had still smiled at his teasing. She finished the sentence. She closed the book on her finger. She looked up. She did not stand. That was the first thing. In 7 years of marriage and the 11 months of betrothal before it, she had stood when he entered a room, every time, without thinking, the way a candle leans toward a draught. Now, she sat. She inclined her head, the same inclination the footman had given him, and said, "You are earlier than I expected." And her voice was the voice he knew, low and clear and untroubled, and he understood, standing in the doorway with his gloves still on, that something in the house had shifted on its foundations while he was away, and that she had been the one to shift it, and that she was, at this moment, watching him to see how long it would take him to notice. He took off his gloves. He took them off slowly, because his hands had begun, unaccountably, to tremble, and he did not wish her to see it. And the act of removing gloves is a thing a man can do without his hands being steady if he is careful. He laid them on the small table by the door. The small table was not where it had been. He said, "You did not write." She said, "No." She said it without apology, without sharpness, the way one might agree that it had not rained. He waited. He had used silence on her before, in the early years, when he had wanted her to fill it with reassurance, and she had filled it, then, every time. She did not fill it now. She kept her finger in the book. She watched him with the patient, courteous attention she had used to give to dull cousins at dinner. Outside, somewhere on the lawn, a child laughed, and the laughter cut through the room like a thin, clear bell, and he turned his head toward the sound before he could stop himself. And when he turned back, she was still watching him, and her face had not changed, but the corner of her mouth had done something that was not a smile, and not a tightening, only the smallest possible acknowledgement that she had seen him turn. He said, "Is that?" He did not finish. She said, "Yes." He said, "He sounds well." She said, "He is well." There was a pause. The pause was not the kind she had used to leave in their conversations, the soft pause of a woman waiting to be told what she thought. It was the pause of a person who has already said what she means, and is allowing the listener time to catch up. He sat down. He had not been invited to sit. He sat down anyway, in the chair across from her, because his knees had decided the matter for him, and he arranged his coat about his thighs, as if the arrangement of the coat were the urgent question. He said, "I have come home." She said, "So I see." He said, "I had thought." He stopped again. He had thought a great many things on the road. He had thought, in particular, that he would walk into this house and that the house would absorb him as it had always absorbed him, that his bath would be drawn and his supper laid and his wife would come to him in the evening with the small grave kiss she had given him on the brow every night of their first year and on perhaps half the nights of their second, and that the matter of the woman in town would be a thing they did not discuss, because they had never discussed any of the others, because she was, he had always told himself with a private warmth, a woman of remarkable understanding. He looked at her now, sitting with her book and her quiet face and her unmoved hands, and he understood, with a slow, cold dropping in his chest, that he had mistaken her understanding for something else entirely. He had mistaken patience for permission. She said, "Will you take tea?" He said, "I will take brandy." She rang the bell. The footman came. She gave the order in the same level voice, and the footman went, and she opened her book again, and she found her place, and she began, calmly, to read. He sat in his own drawing room and watched his wife read, and the clock on the mantel ticked, and the child laughed again somewhere outside, and the long afternoon light moved a fraction across the carpet, and he discovered, in the silence she had declined to fill, that he was afraid. He had not been afraid in this house in 20 years. He had been a boy of 9 the last time, when his father had sent for him in the library, and the library door had closed behind him with that particular oiled hush, and the fear then had been simple, a child's fear of a known punishment. This fear was not simple. This fear had no shape yet. It was only the awareness that the room he was sitting in had been arranged, in his absence, by a mind he had stopped attending to, and that the arrangement was not for his comfort. The brandy came. He drank half of it at once. She turned a page, he said, at last, because he could not bear the page turning. "Where is Mr. Howling?" Mr. Howling was his steward. Mr. Howling had been his father's steward, and his father's steward before that for the last 6 years of the old man's life, and Mr. Howling lived in the small stone house at the foot of the avenue and walked up to the house every morning at 8. And the idea of asking where Mr. Howling was, in his own drawing room, was so strange that he heard himself ask it as if from a distance. She said, "Mr. Howling is in the village." She said it pleasantly. She said, "He no longer comes up to the house," and added, after the smallest possible breath, "On Tuesdays." He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "And the other days." She said, "Mr. Pelfrey comes on the other days." He had never heard of Mr. Pelfrey. She seemed to know this. She closed her book again, this time without keeping her finger in the place, and laid it on the small table beside her, and folded her hands in her lap, the way she had been taught as a girl to fold them when she was about to be examined by her governess. And he remembered with a pang he did not want, that she had told him about that governess on their wedding journey, in a low, confiding voice, in a room with yellow curtains, when she had still believed he wished to know such things. She said, "Mr. Pelfrey is the attorney I have engaged." He set the brandy down. He set it down carefully. The glass made a small, precise sound against the wood, and the sound was the only sound in the room, and he watched her hands and she watched his face, and he said, in a voice he tried to keep level, "You have engaged an attorney." She said, "Yes." He said, "For what purpose?" She said, "For several purposes." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. He felt, distinctly, the floor of the room he had grown up in tilt a degree under his chair, and he set his palm flat against his knee to steady himself, and he said, with a smile he could feel pulling unevenly at his mouth, "You have been busy then, in my absence." She said, "Yes." She said it without irony. She said it the way she might have agreed that the roses had bloomed. He stood up. He had not meant to stand up. He stood up because the sitting had become unbearable, and he walked to the window, and he looked out over the lawn that he had walked on as a child and ridden across as a young man and watched, from this very window, as the workman had set the new fountain into the grass the spring after his father died. The fountain was gone. He stood very still. He said, without turning, "The fountain." She said, behind him, "I had it removed." He said, "You." She said, "Yes." She said, "It leaked." She said, "And it was ugly." The last word was the only word she had spoken since he came into the room that had in it any private feeling at all, and the feeling was not the feeling he would have chosen for her to have. He turned around. She was still sitting. Her hands were still folded. The light from the window was behind him now, and fell on her face, and showed him, for the first time in 7 years, the woman who had been writing letters and signing papers and walking the long gravel of the drive, while he had been 300 miles away, choosing a bracelet, and he saw, with the slow astonishment of a man recognizing a stranger in his own bed, that she was beautiful. She had always been handsome. She had not, in his memory, been beautiful. Beauty in his wife had been a thing he had not required, because he had had it elsewhere, and the having it elsewhere had been so easy and so cheap that he had grown careless about what he had at home. He saw now, in the unforgiving afternoon, that the carelessness had cost him something he had not bothered to put a price on. She let him look. She did not lower her eyes. He said, "I will go up and change." She said, "Of course." He said, "We will speak at supper." She said, "As you wish." He went out of the room. He passed the footman in the hall, who again inclined his head, the precise, courteous inch. And he climbed the stairs to his own apartments with the gait of a man who has been walking all day, and at the door of his dressing room he stopped, because the door of his dressing room had been locked and the key was not in it. He stood with his hand on the handle and the handle would not turn, and from the long gallery behind him he heard the small, clear bell of the child's laughter again, closer now, coming up from the garden door, and a young, light, unfamiliar voice saying, with the delighted insistence of a small boy who has been told a secret and is not quite sure he believes it, "Is he here, Mama? Is he really here?" And a woman's voice, not his wife's, the voice of a nurse perhaps, hushing the boy gently, and the boy's voice again, dropping confidingly, asking, "And what shall I call him then?" And the nurse, after the smallest hesitation, answering, "You shall call him Sir, my lamb. Only, sir," the way the gentlefolk do. And the boy considering this and accepting it, the way children accept the strange arrangements of adults, and the footsteps moving away down the gallery, and the dressing room door under his hand still immovably locked. He stood there for what he afterward could not have called a long time or a short time, only a time outside the usual measure, with his palm on a brass handle that had been his father's and his grandfather's, and that had never in his life refused him. And he listened to the small footsteps recede, and to the nurse's low voice fading, and to the house breathing around him in its new, careful, considered rhythm, and he understood that the boy in the gallery was his son, and that his son had been instructed to call him Sir. He took his hand off the handle. He walked back along the gallery in the other direction, because he could not, at that moment, bear to walk in the direction the child had gone, and he came to the long window at the head of the stairs and stood at it and looked out without seeing. After a while he went down. He did not ring for anyone. He went into the library, because the library had always been his, in the particular way a man's library is his, with the smell of old paper and pipe smoke soaked into the curtains and the chair by the fire molded to the shape of his back. And he opened the door and stopped on the threshold because the curtains had been taken down and washed and rehung, and the pipe smoke smell was gone, and the chair by the fire was the chair he remembered, but the small table beside it had been replaced with a writing desk, and on the writing desk were ledgers, and the ledgers were open, and the handwriting in the ledgers was not Mr. Halling's. He went to the desk. He had not been forbidden to. He picked up the topmost ledger. He read 3 lines and put it down. He picked up the next. He read a column of figures and a marginal note, and the small, neat initials at the foot of an entry, initials that were not his and not Halling's, and he put that ledger down too. He sat in his chair, which still fit him, and he stared at the cold grate, and after a long while he became aware that there was a folded paper on the corner of the desk addressed in his wife's hand to him. He did not open it at once. He looked at it. The hand had not changed. The letters were the same letters she had drawn on the cards she had sent him in the first year, when she had still sent cards, the same long, deliberate L, the same closed O. He had loved her hand once. He had told her so, on a balcony, in a season he could no longer accurately date. He picked up the paper. He unfolded it. He read. He read it twice, the second time more slowly than the first. And when he had finished, he sat with it on his knee and listened to a clock he could not see strike the half-hour in some other room, and he discovered that his mouth was dry. The paper said very little. The paper said that supper would be served at the usual hour. The paper said that Mr. Pelfrey would attend at 10 the following morning at her ladyship's request, and that his grace was welcome to be present. The paper said that the boy had been told his father was a traveler who had come a long way and would be tired, and that no introduction need be made tonight unless his grace wished it. The paper was signed with her name only, not her title, not the formula she had used in every note of 7 years, only her given name in the long, deliberate hand with the small closed O, and a full stop after it, which he had never in his life seen her use after her own name before. He sat with the paper a long time. The light in the library went thin and then gold and then the color of weak tea, and at last a footman came to the door, not the footman from the steps, but another, equally polite, equally unfamiliar, and said that supper was served. He went in. She was at the foot of the table. He went to the head, because the head was his, and he sat there, and the soup came, and the soup was good, and the wine was the wine he had laid down himself in the 2nd year, and the candles were lit, and the room was as it had always been, except in every detail in which it was not. She did not speak first. She ate. She ate as she had been taught to eat, neatly, without sound, and she let him fill the silences, and he filled them, at first with the easy small talk of a returning husband, the roads, the weather, the price of horses at the last fair, and she received each remark with a small, grave attention and offered nothing in return except, now and then, a courteous monosyllable that closed the topic like a door. By the fish he had begun to hear his own voice. By the meat he had stopped. He drank. He watched her. She had ordered, he realized, dishes he disliked, not flagrantly, not in any way he could have named at the table without sounding ridiculous. She had simply chosen, throughout, the variations he found dull and avoided the ones he loved, and the choice was consistent enough that it could not be accident, and discreet enough that it could not be complained of, and he saw, with a slow, hot prickling at the back of his neck, that she had been practicing. At the end of the meal, she rose. She did not wait for him to dismiss her, as she had used to, with the small grave kiss on the brow that had been the ritual of his evenings. She rose and inclined her head, the inclination that everyone in this house seemed now to have learned, and she said, I have had your old room made up for you tonight. The old room. The room he had slept in as a boy. The room with the narrow bed and the cold east window and the small portrait of his great aunt that he had been afraid of when he was 7. He set his glass down. He said, "My room." She said, "Your room is being repainted." She said it as if this were a thing he might have been expected to know. She said, "You did write, did you not, that you would not be home until autumn?" He had written that. He had written it in a fit of carelessness in the second week of his absence, when he had thought himself happy. He said after a moment, "And when shall I have my room back?" She said, "When it is finished." She did not say when that would be. She inclined her head again. She left. He sat at the table with the candles guttering and the servants standing at the wall like patient stone, and the wine sour in his mouth. And he understood that he had been moved, in his own house, to the room of a boy, and that the move had been arranged so neatly and so reasonably that he could not object to it without seeming a fool, and that this was only the first of the small, reasonable things that were going to be done to him, and that they had all been thought out, by her, slowly, in the long evenings he had not been here. He went up. He slept badly. The narrow bed was narrower than he remembered. The great aunt watched him from the wall. Toward dawn, he dreamed of the fountain, intact, and woke with a thirst he could not satisfy. At 10, he was in the small drawing room because she had said 10, and at 3 minutes past 10, Mr. Pelfrey was shown in, and Mr. Pelfrey was not what he had expected. He had expected an old man, soft-handed, deferential, the kind of country attorney who came up to the house once a quarter and ate too much at luncheon. Mr. Pelfrey was perhaps 40. Mr. Pelfrey was thin. Mr. Pelfrey had the courteous, unhurried manner of a man who has read a great deal and slept well, and he bowed to him with exact propriety, and to her with a degree more warmth, and he sat where she indicated, and he opened a leather case on his knees, and he said, with the quiet of a surgeon laying out instruments, "Shall we begin, my lady?" She said, "Please." He had not been spoken to. He sat in the third chair, the chair set at an angle to the other two, the chair of the witness rather than the principal, and he understood the geometry of the room at once and felt, again, the slow tilt under him. Mr. Pelfrey took out the first paper. He read it aloud. He read it in a voice trained for the reading of papers, level, unhurried, allowing each clause its full weight, and the paper was a deed of trust, dated 4 years prior, signed by His Grace at the bottom in his own large, careless hand, and by his lady in her small, deliberate one, and witnessed by 2 men he could not now remember. He remembered the day. He remembered it dimly. He had been on his way to the races. He had come into the morning room with his hat in his hand, and Mr. Halling had stood at his shoulder and said, "A formality, your grace, your lady's settlement, the small matter of the boy's portion, a half-hour at most," and he had said, of course," and he had signed where the finger pointed, 4 pages, 6 pages, he had not counted, and he had kissed his wife's hand without looking at her face, and he had gone to the races, and he had won. He remembered winning. He had not remembered the papers. He listened now to Mr. Pelfrey, read them, and he discovered, clause by clause, what he had signed. He had signed, in the cheerful hurry of a man going to the races, a settlement that placed the boy's portion and the entail of 3 of the smaller estates, and the rents of the home farm, and the management of a fund whose size he had not, at the time, troubled to calculate, into the sole and uncontested control of his wife during the boy's minority, with full discretion as to investment, expenditure, education, and residence, and with the right, specified in a clause numbered 17, to appoint and dismiss any officer of the household or estate whose duties touched upon the boy's interest, which, on a reading by a careful attorney, meant any officer at all. He had signed, that morning, the keys to his own house. He had signed them because Mr. Halling had said it was a formality. He had signed them because he had wanted to be at the races by noon. He had signed them because he had not, at any point in his marriage, considered that the woman across from him at breakfast might one day read what he had handed her. Mr. Pelfrey finished the deed. He laid it down. He took out the second paper. The second paper was newer. The second paper was a petition, lodged 11 weeks earlier in the appropriate court, for the alteration of the boy's surname, on the grounds, set out in the body of the petition, in a hand he did not know, but in language he recognized painfully as his own wife's, that the boy's interests, his property, his prospects, his standing in the county and in the world were better served by the surname of his mother's house than by the surname of his father, given the father's recent and notorious conduct. The petition had been granted. Mr. Pelfrey laid down the order of the court. He took out the third paper. The third paper was a will, his wife's will, drawn the previous month, in which the boy, under his new name, was constituted the sole heir of certain properties whose title, by the deed of trust read first, had passed, lawfully and irrevocably, out of his Grace's gift 4 years ago. He listened to all of this without moving. He listened to it the way a man listens to a verdict that he has, in some chamber of himself, been expecting for longer than he knew. When Mr. Pelfrey had finished, and had folded his hands on his knees, and had looked, with the small, grave attention of a man who has done his work, not at his Grace but at her ladyship, there was a pause. Into the pause, his Grace said, in a voice he tried very hard to keep at the level of polite enquiry, "You have changed my son's name," she said. "He is my son also." He said, "You have changed his name." She said, "Yes." He said, "Without my consent." She said, "With your consent." She said, "You signed it." He had begun to shake. He had not noticed when it had begun. He set his hands flat on his thighs to stop them, and he said, "You tricked me." She said, "No." She said it without heat. She said, "You did not read." He stood up. The chair scraped behind him on the polished floor, and the sound was loud in the room, and Mr. Pelfrey did not flinch, and she did not flinch. And he stood there in the middle of his own small drawing room with his hands fisted at his sides, and he heard himself say, loudly, more loudly than he had meant, "You have made me a stranger in my own house." She let the silence hold. He did not fill it. After a moment she said, very quietly, "You made yourself one." He sat down. He sat down because his legs had again decided the matter. He sat down and put his face in his hands and was angry that he had put his face in his hands and did not, for a long moment, take it away. When he did, she was watching him with the same patient, courteous attention, and Mr. Pelfrey was looking, tactfully, at the leather case on his knees. He said in a different voice, a voice he had not used in this house in many years, "And what do you want of me?" She said, "Very little." She said, "Your absence, chiefly." She said as before. The wryness of the last 3 words was so small, so dry, so exactly placed, that he understood, sitting opposite her, that she had been the wittier of them all along, and that he had simply not been listening. He did not leave that day. He could not, and she knew he could not, and she did him the courtesy of not naming it. There was the question of his horses. There was the question of his valet, who had been sent on by an earlier coach and who was now installed, very contentedly, in a back room of the servants' wing eating cold pie and telling the kitchen girls about the inns on the southern road. There was, above all, the question of the boy, whom he had not yet seen, and whom he had begun, in the long hours of the previous night in the narrow bed, under the great-aunt's painted eye, to wish to see, with a wish that surprised him by its sharpness. He spent that morning in the library, which was no longer his. He spent the afternoon walking in the garden, which had been replanted in places he did not remember authorizing. He walked past the bed where the fountain had been, and the grass there was new, a paler green than the grass around it, and he stood and looked at the paler green for some minutes, and then he walked on. He came around the corner of the yew hedge, which had been clipped into a shape it had never previously assumed, and there, on the lower lawn, was a small boy in a blue coat, sitting on the grass with a wooden horse on its side beside him, conducting, with great seriousness, a conversation between the horse and a tin soldier. The boy looked up. The boy had his mother's eyes. He had known this in some way before he saw it, because she had written it to him in the 2nd month of the boy's life, in a letter he had read carelessly over his coffee at the lodge, and the carelessness of that morning came back to him now with a sting that astonished him. The boy stood. The boy bowed. The boy had been taught to bow, and he did it with the small, grave attention of a child who is doing a thing he has been told is important. The boy said, "Good afternoon, sir." He said, "Good afternoon." The boy looked at him with a calm, friendly curiosity, the curiosity of a child to whom adults were a long-running and not particularly absorbing entertainment, and said, "Are you the traveler?" he said after a moment. "Yes." The boy nodded as if this confirmed something he had suspected. The boy said, "Have you come from very far?" He said, "Yes." The boy said, "Did you see the sea?" He said, "No." The boy seemed sorry for him about this. The boy said, "Mama has seen the sea. She has told me. It is gray, and it is green, and it is sometimes blue, and it has gulls on it that take your bread if you are not careful," he said. "So I have heard." The boy considered him for another moment, with the cool, democratic attention of a small child, and then crouched down again to his horse and his soldier, having evidently decided that the conversation had reached its natural close, and he stood there a few feet off and watched his son resume the muttered governance of the wooden horse, and could not, for some time, make himself move. After a while he sat, awkwardly, on the bench at the edge of the lawn. The boy did not seem to mind. The boy played. The afternoon went on. At one point the boy looked up and said, "Sir, would you hold the soldier, only for a moment, because the horse must speak to him and I cannot do both voices." And he held out his hand for the soldier, and his grace took the soldier and held it as instructed. And the boy did the horse's voice in a small, important rumble, and the soldier was required to answer, "Yes, Captain," and "Very good, Captain," at the appropriate intervals. And he found, to his own confusion, that he was answering "Yes, Captain," and "Very good, Captain" in a voice that was not entirely steady, and that the boy was nodding approvingly each time, and that the late sun was warm on the back of his neck. After perhaps a quarter of an hour, the nurse came down the path. The nurse was a calm, thin woman of about 50 with very clean hands, and she curtsied to him with exact correctness and said, in the unhurried voice of a person who has been told, in advance, exactly what to say, "Master Edmund, it is time for your tea." The boy stood up. The boy bowed again. The boy said, "Thank you, sir, for being the soldier." He said, "You are welcome." The boy went away up the path with his hand in the nurse's hand, and at the turn of the path he looked back, once, briefly, and then he was gone. Master Edmund. The name was not the name he had given. The name he had given was his father's name, after his father, and the boy's first name had been recorded as that name in the family book 7 years ago in his own untidy hand. Edmund was the name of her father, who had died the spring before they were married, of whom she had spoken seldom and warmly. He sat on the bench. He sat for a long time. The shadows of the yew came across the lawn and reached the bench and went past it. He thought, with a clarity that was almost a relief, that he had not known the boy's voice. He had not known what the boy called his nurse. He had not known that the boy liked tin soldiers more than he liked the wooden horse, although the boy plainly did. He had not known that the boy bowed when he met a stranger and called him sir, as he had been told. He had not known any of it, because he had not been there, and he had not been there because he had not, at any point in 7 years, considered it necessary to be. He went in at last. He went to his old room, the boy's room he had once been, and he sat in the window and watched the dusk come down over the garden that had been altered without him, and the great-aunt watched him from the wall, and at some point he heard the small clear bell of his son's laughter, very far off, from the upper nursery, and he put his face against the cold pane of the window and did not move for a while. The next morning he came down early. He had decided in the night to be reasonable. He had decided in the night to speak to her as one rational person to another, to acknowledge what required acknowledgement, to propose terms. He had rehearsed sentences. He had rehearsed them several times, lying on his back in the narrow bed, and the sentences had seemed, at 3 a.m, both dignified and just. He found her in the breakfast room. She was alone. There was coffee. She poured it for him, because she had always poured his coffee, and the small gesture, performed without comment, undid for an instant his rehearsed sentences, and he sat down opposite her and could not, for a moment, remember the first of them. He drank the coffee. He set the cup down. He said, "We must speak." She said, "We are speaking." He said, "About the boy." She said, "Yes." He said, "I should like to know him." She looked at him over her cup. She did not answer at once. She set the cup down. She said, "You are welcome to know him." He had expected to have to fight for this. He had prepared, in the night, several arguments, several appeals, a reminder of his rights, and a hint of his consequences. He was disarmed by the plainness of her permission and sat for a moment with nothing to say. She said after a pause, "On certain conditions." He said, "Naturally." She said, "You will not tell him, this year or next, who you are to him." He said, "He is my son." She said, "He is a child of 7. She said, "He has been told that his father lives abroad and is not well, and that one day perhaps they will meet." She said, "He does not need, at present, to be told that his father is the traveler who held the soldier." He said nothing. She said, "In time, if you are constant, he may be told." She said the word constant without emphasis, and the absence of emphasis was itself the emphasis. He said, "I see." She said, "You will not enter the nursery without the nurse's leave. You will not give the boy gifts without first showing them to me. You will not speak to him of his name." He said, "His name." She said, "His name is Edmund Maitland." She said it evenly. Maitland was her father's name. He had known it would be. He said, "And mine." She said, "You may bear what name you choose." She did not smile. She did not need to. He said, after a long moment, "You have thought of everything." She said, "I have had time." He drank more coffee. He said, finally, "And you?" She said, "What of me?" He said, "What am I to be to you?" She set down her cup. She folded her hands. She said, "You are to be civil." She said, "You are to be at this table, when you are in this house, at the hours I keep. You are to be in your own apartments by 10 in the evening. You are not to bring any person into this house without my consent." She paused. She said, "You are not to bring her into this house at all." The pronoun did not require explanation. He said, after a silence, "And if I refuse?" She said, "You will not refuse." She said it without threat. She said it the way one might tell a child that the rain would stop. She said, "You will not refuse, because the alternative is the courts, and the courts will go as Mr. Pelfrey will tell you they will go, and your name, which you have already done a great deal to embarrass, will not survive what would be read in them." She said, "You may, of course, choose the courts." He did not choose the courts. He stayed. He stayed through the summer, and through the long, mild autumn, and into the first frosts. He kept to her hours. He came to the table at her hours and left it at her hours. He sat in the chair set at the angle, in conversations with Mr. Halling and with Mr. Pelfrey and with the new agent whose name he learned to pronounce, and he listened. And he learned, slowly, what he had not learned in 15 years of being master of the place, which was how the place ran. He went, when invited, to the garden in the late afternoon, and he held the soldier, and he was yes captain and very good captain, and once, in late September, when the boy had fallen and grazed his palm, and had come to him because he was the nearest adult, and had not yet been taught not to, he had wiped the small palm with his own handkerchief, and the boy had thanked him gravely and run off, and he had stood with the handkerchief in his hand for some minutes before he had put it back in his pocket. He did not see her except at meals and at the morning hour with Mr. Pelfrey. She did not unbend. She was not cruel. She was simply finished with a particular use of her face, which she had used on him for 7 years and would not use again. He understood this without being told. He wrote, in October, to the woman in town. He wrote a careful, courteous, final letter. He signed it with his name, the whole of it, and he sealed it with his ring, and he gave it to a footman, and that was the end of that. He did not afterward regret it. He had thought he would. He did not. He had had all his life the easy man's confidence that he could withdraw from any arrangement without cost, and discovered now, in his 40th year, that he had been wrong about this in the only arrangement that had mattered, and the discovery left him quieter than he had been. Winter came. The boy was given a small pony, and learned, with great seriousness, to sit it. His Grace, who had not been consulted, was invited to walk beside the pony on the lower drive, and did so, with a hand at the bridle, on 3 afternoons a week through November. While the nurse walked at a discreet distance and his wife watched, sometimes, from the window of the small drawing room with her book in her lap, the boy spoke to him, on these walks, of a great many things, of the names of birds, of the question of whether the gardener's cat was the same cat as the cat in the stable, or a different cat of the same color, of why the moon was sometimes there in the afternoon when it ought to have been at night. He answered with what care he could. He found, to his surprise, that he liked answering. He had not, in his life, been often asked questions whose answers mattered to the questioner. The boy did not call him sir after the first month. The boy called him, instead, by no name at all, addressing him by a small clearing of the throat or a tug at the cuff, the way children address adults they have decided to keep but have not yet been told how to name. He did not press. He had been told not to press. He did not press. Once, in early December, walking beside the pony in a thin, cold sun, the boy said, without preliminary, "My mama says you have come to live with us." He said, after a moment, "Yes." The boy said, "For how long?" He said, "As long as your mama likes." The boy considered this and seemed to find it satisfactory. The boy said, after a further moment, with the casual interest of a child inquiring about the weather, "Do you like us?" He said, "Yes." The boy nodded, evidently expecting no other answer, and returned to the question of the gardener's cat. At Christmas, there was the usual gathering, smaller than it had been, because she had pruned the guest list in his absence with the same quiet thoroughness she had brought to everything else. And there were aunts, and there was a cousin of his whom he had not seen in 9 years, and the cousin took him aside on the second evening, in the long gallery, and said, "You look well." He said, "Do I?" The cousin said, "You look like a man who has had a fright and is the better for it." He did not answer that. The cousin said, after a pause, "She is a remarkable woman, you know." He said, "I am beginning to know." The cousin said, "She always was." He had not. He had married a woman his mother had chosen, in a season he could not now accurately date, for reasons of property and lineage and a vague impression of suitability, and he had taken her composure for absence, and her patience for vacancy, and her silences for empty rooms. And he had walked through those empty rooms for 7 years, without noticing that they were furnished, and that the furniture was good. The cousin said, "You will not, I hope, undo it." He said, "I do not think I could, even if I wished to." He did not wish to. He discovered this slowly, over the long blue evenings of January, when he sat in the library that was not his and read the books that had been chosen in his absence by a mind he was learning to respect, and looked up sometimes at the fire and thought, with a settled, unspectacular surprise, that he had become, in his own house, a guest, and that the house was the better for it, and that he was, perhaps, the better for it too. In February, the boy had a fever. The fever was not dangerous, the doctor said, but the fever was unpleasant, and the boy was fretful, and on the third night, when the nurse had been awake for 2 nights running, His Grace, passing the nursery door in the small hours on his way back from the library, was met by the nurse coming out, and the nurse, who was a woman of sense, said only, "He is asking for his mamma, sir, and her ladyship is asleep at last in the next room, and I have not the heart." And he said, after a moment, "I will sit with him." The nurse looked at him. The nurse looked at him for a longer moment than was strictly polite. The nurse said, very quietly, "Yes, sir," and stood aside. He went in. The room was warm and smelled of camphor. The boy was small in the bed. The boy's eyes were bright with the fever and unfocused, and the boy turned his head when he came in and said in the thin, reedy voice of a sick child, "Is that you?" He said yes. The boy seemed to find this acceptable, although it was not clear who he had been expecting. He sat on the chair by the bed. He took the boy's hand. The hand was hot and small, and the fingers closed around 2 of his at once, with the unthinking trust of a child too tired to choose, and he sat there in the dim, camphor-smelling room, and the boy drowsed and woke and drowsed, and at one point said, very clearly, "Tell me a story." And he said, after a moment in which he understood he had not in his life told a story, "I will try." He told one. He told a poor one. He told a story about a horse that lost its rider and found its way home through a wood, and he made it up as he went, and the horse was brave, and the wood was dark, and the home, in the end, had a yellow window in it, and a person at the window with a lamp, and the boy, drowsing, said, "Who's home?" And he said, after a moment, "The horses." And the boy was satisfied and slept. He sat with the boy's hand in his until the gray began at the window. At some point, without his knowing exactly when, the door behind him opened, and she came in. She did not speak. She stood for a moment behind his chair. He did not turn. He felt her look at the boy, and at the hand in his, and at the back of his head, and then she went, without sound, the way she did everything, and the door closed, and he understood that something had passed between them that would not be named, and that did not need to be. In the morning the fever was less, by evening it was gone. The boy, recovering, was magnanimous, and granted audience to his pony from the window, and ate a small bowl of broth, and told the nurse, with the great seriousness of a child reporting an important matter, that the traveler had told him a story about a horse, and the nurse said, "Did he indeed?" And the boy said, "Yes, and it was a good story." And the nurse said gravely, "I am glad to hear it." She did not speak of it. She did not speak of any of it. But at supper that evening she had ordered without comment the dish he had always loved, the one she had been so careful, in his first week's home, not to put before him. He looked at the dish. He looked at her. She did not look up. She ate, neatly, without sound, and he ate, and the candles burned, and after a while she said, in the same level voice with which she had said everything else that mattered, "You may, if you wish, take the boy to see the sea in the summer." He set his glass down. He said after a moment, "I should like that very much." She said, "We shall see." The "we" in her mouth was the first "we" she had used to him in 7 months, and he heard it, and did not remark on it, and went on with his supper. And the room around them did not change, and yet the room around them was not the same room it had been at the beginning of the meal, and he understood, sitting at the head of his own table with a wife at the foot of it who had taken his name from his son and his house from his hand and given him, in their place, a chair to sit in and a story to tell, that he had been given, very late, a thing he had not deserved, and that he intended, for as long as she let him, to be worthy of it. Spring came. The grass over the bed where the fountain had been grew in at last and matched. The boy went to the sea in July, with his mother, and with the traveler, who walked behind them on the shingle, and who held a small jacket and a small bucket, and did not, on the whole, speak unless spoken to, and the boy ran ahead at the water's edge, and shouted at the gulls in delight, and the gulls declined to be impressed, and his grace stood at a little distance with the bucket and watched, and his wife, in a plain straw hat that the wind kept threatening to take, stood beside him for a long moment without speaking, and at last said, "He is not afraid of it." He said, "No." She said, "I was afraid of it the first time." He said, "You never told me." She said, "You never asked." She said it without sharpness. She said it the way one notes a small old fact about the weather of a long-ago year. He said, "After a while, I am asking now." She looked at him. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She said, "There is time, perhaps, to tell you." She did not say there was. She said there was, perhaps. He took it. He had learned by then to take what was offered and not to ask for more. The gulls cried. The boy shouted. The wind worked at the brim of her hat, and after a moment, without thinking, he reached up and held the brim for her, and she let him, and they stood like that for a moment, 2 people on a shingle beach with a small boy at the water's edge and a wind at their backs, and a great deal still unsaid between them, and most of it, perhaps, never to be said. But the silence between them was no longer the silence of an empty room, and it was, on that afternoon, enough. And so, dear listener, that is where I leave them, with the gulls and the wind and the small boy who will, in his own time and not before, be told who the traveler was, and with a woman who used the only weapons that had been given her, which were her patience and her wits and her husband's own careless hand, and used them so cleanly that no one, in the end, could call her cruel, and with a man who came home to find himself erased and discovered. Slowly, and to his own astonishment, that being erased was not the end of him, but the beginning of someone else. If you have ever been overlooked in a room where you had every right to be seen, if you have ever sat very still while a careless voice spoke over yours and waited, with a patience that surprised even you, for the moment when speaking would do more than shouting, if you have ever picked up a pen instead of raising your voice, and signed your name slowly, and let the paper do what your tongue could not, then you have, in your way, sat at her table, and you have known the particular quiet satisfaction of being underestimated by someone who will, one day, look up and understand. Tell me, by the fire here, which moment stayed with you? Was it the locked door of the dressing room? Or the boy in the blue coat with the wooden horse? Or the dish she set before him the night the fever broke? Or the brim of the straw hat in the wind? I should like to know. And if you have liked sitting with me tonight, draw your chair a little closer for the next one, and bring a friend if you have one to bring. For there is another story waiting, and the fire is still good, and the night, as you can see, is long. Sleep well, traveler. I will keep the lamp lit.